Okay, so thanks for having me. And so today I'm just going to give some basic details about the LAD. No heavy lifting or anything, no math or anything like that. So you may be asking yourself, what am I doing here? Why am I the person talking about the LAD? I guess partly because I continue to use it as part of a project for Charitable Giving. That was part of the LAD pilot back in 2015. So I guess in terms of LAD users in the RDC, I'm sort of one of the longest serving users that's out there. So I spent a lot of time with it, so I have some details about the ins and outs. So basically today what's going to happen is, just in case you're here and you haven't even ever heard of this data set before, I'm just going to give you a basic rundown of what the LAD is and what's in there. And then because my work with the LAD is about charitable giving, I'll discuss a little bit about why the LAD is good for charitable giving compared to other data sets you could use. And then just a quick discussion of my past and ongoing projects. And then I'll get into some issues that you might run into in using the LAD, so general issues that apply to anyone, and then a few sort of charity-specific issues, just in case you're interested. Okay, so what is LAD? So Longitudinal Administrative Databank. It's a 20% panel of Canadian tax filers, and so because it's a panel of Canadian tax filers, not surprisingly, it has information on your income, your tax returns for the individual, but also linked to your spouse and other dependents as well, so your other family members. So a typical row in the LAD has information about you, your spouse or partner, and other family members as well. So I'll talk more in detail about the exact variables that are in there. There's a really small number of demographics. Okay, so the LAD is mostly just your tax records, but they actually add some demographics in there as well, mostly stuff that's in your tax form. And then one of the nice features of the LAD that I guess it's not really emphasized as much maybe as it should be is that it's linked with this Longitudinal Immigration Database. So we know some details about certain immigrants to Canada who are filers at the time that they land in Canada. Okay, so that's something that's going to be useful for us in the future. We have a project looking at immigrants. So the best thing about LAD is that it's a panel, makes it easy to track people over time, and I'm assuming we're all economists here, maybe not Pat, but as we know, having longitudinal data is great for all kinds of economic applications, right? So controlling for unobserved heterogeneity with things like fixed effects. Okay, so where does the LAD come from? So I guess, statistical mom of LAD is the T1 family file. And this is an annual cross-section of all tax files in Canada. And on top of that, there's some additional people in there as well. So non-filers who are linked to a filer through their spousal information. And also kids who collect the Canada Child Tax Benefit. So those are linked through other administrative records. So mostly it's tax filers though. And so the LAD just basically takes a 20% random sample of that. Okay. The key thing though is that it's a longitudinal sample, which means that if you're chosen at some point in time in the data, you continue to be chosen until you are dead or leave the data for some other reason, and then you're replaced with someone else. Okay, so and that linkage happens through your social insurance number. So the way that the data is sampled is at the individual level. And one of the things they emphasize to us in the LAD pilot is that you really want to be using this mostly for individual analysis only, not family analysis, although I think that has since changed. So the individual sampled, there is family information in there. Okay, so if there's family information attached to the record in the T1 family file, that's also kept in the LAD. Okay, so I have more detail on that later. And so as I said, people, for various reasons, will leave the data. Either they're deceased, or they just stop filing entirely for some other unknown reason, or they leave the country. And for that reason, and also just population growth in the number of filers, the data is refreshed annually. Okay, so it is annually a 20% sample of LAD. Yeah. of the TIF.
Can you say when people die?
Yeah, yeah. So there's information about year of death. Yeah. Okay. So what's in the LAD? Okay. So it's an income tax form. So not shockingly, there's lots of information on your income. So we know, for instance, your total income pre and post tax. We can drill down in terms of income from total to your market income and your government transfers. In terms of market income, we have employment, investment, capital gains, other income. So there's lots of detail there on different subcategories of your income. Okay. Government transfers, all kinds of them here. I'm just reading off a list because I couldn't remember these all. But child-related transfers, disability-related, EI, tax credits, things like that. There's also information on how much tax you pay, so your total tax paid. So the long list of refundable and non-refundable credits, those are all outlined as well in the data set at the federal and provincial levels. Any deductions, RSP deductions, things like that, that's counted as well. And any payroll taxes that you identify on the tax form. Okay. And then the small number of demographics. So personal characteristics, your marital status, sex, your age, okay? Those are all listed in the LAD. We know some family characteristics, so I guess marital status fits in there, but also number of kids that you have. There's, I guess, new in the LAD, as I was reading the documentation yesterday, there's now well, there's always a family identifier, but now there's also a family weight that you can apply to data analysis if you're doing that at the family level, okay? Previously, that was not there. Geography is great, actually. You can drill down all the way down to the postal 6-character postal code level. I guess you have to specifically state to StatCan why you want that level of detail. But there's also all the standard census geographies. Forward sortation area, I believe, is there as well without asking specifically for it. So any geography you can think of that you use for analysis is there. And as I said, there's the immigration stuff that I'll talk about in a second. So it's linked to this Longitudinal Immigrant Database. I've never used that data set on its own. There's a larger set of variables in there that are contained in LAD, so the LAD only has a subset of the most, I guess, important characteristics of the IMDb. So for instance, we've got year of landing, your marital stat. So these are all characteristics of the immigrant at landing. Years of schooling, intended occupation, I think, was in there last time I looked. Country of birth, country of residence, citizenship, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so lots of actually fine, detailed stuff about immigrants in there if you're thinking about doing a longitudinal immigrant analysis. Okay, so that's in the LAD. Yep.
Correct that the IMDb itself has all that tax information in it?
I don't know, actually. So I've never actually looked into that.
Yeah, so it is because I use that database. So what I did was compare to the IMDb connected to the tax thing.
Okay.
I don't have any Canadians, but I have the tax.
Right. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So that's what's in the LAD. So now, suppose you walk into the RDC tomorrow and you open up the folder where the data is stored. What are you going to see? Okay. So basically, the way it's structured in the data folders is that there's this thing called the LAD register. Okay, and this is effectively in year T. So this is just, for example, based on 2016, the latest year of the LAD. That's a listing of everybody who's ever been in the data. Okay, so it's just one row is each individual who has ever been in the data. And in that data set is also a series of flags from 1982, which is the first year, till the present, which tells you if they have any information in that year. So a yes/no variable to tell you if they filed that year. Okay. And for some reason, they also have year of birth, year of death, sex, and I think marital status in there. I don't know why that's in there, but because it's also in the other data set. But that's in there. So if you want to work with the LAD, longitudinally, which I assume that you do, because why else would you use the LAD? You have to then link in all the individual yearly data sets that are stored separately. Okay? So there's one all from 82 up to 2016. Those contain all the income tax records that you want to work with. And separately, actually, there's an identical set of data sets which houses the child information. Okay, so those are separate from the regular LAD files, and the immigrant files as well are also separate. So you have to sort of, if you want everything in there, you got to merge in 3 different data sets into the register to work with that. Okay, and there's there's an individual identifier called LIN, which is the way you link those. I think it's just scrambled social insurance number. Okay, so that's how you work with the data set. Okay, so here's where things get a little bit confusing if you're like me. Okay? I don't catch on to things quickly. So each row in the LAD is one tax filer. Okay, but as separate variables, they also have information on your spouse or parent if you're a kid, your whole family, and then the child themselves. Okay, and these are all identified through different suffixes that are attached to the variables. Okay, so if you're thinking about, say, market income, you'll have the variable name with an I on the end of it telling you that's the individual's market income. With a P on the end, that's the aggregate of your spouse or parent. With the F, that's family, and so on. Okay, so it's a really wide set of variables here. So in some cases, there are same variables in there 4 times at different levels of aggregation. Okay, so it becomes a little bit confusing to work with it, but that's how they're identified there in the LAD. Okay, and by family, we mean census family. That's the family concept used in the LAD. So I just wanted to highlight specifically the spousal parent level of aggregation because that has confused me the most out of all of them. Okay, because just from the projects I was working on, I needed the spousal information. So here's how you would interpret that if you were looking at market income. So that's the MKINCP is the market income. So if you're in a couple family, okay, so if you're a married couple with or without kids, for the parents, that variable is the sum of the parent's income. So it's the sum of you and your spouse's income. Okay, so it's not just your spouse's income. This confused me massively when I was working with this at first. So if you want just your spouse's income, you have to subtract your income from that variable. Okay, what was even more confusing to me was if you're the kid in a couple family, then that variable is also the sum of your parents' income. Okay? So you really have to make sure you're identifying who's who in the family. Okay? And there's a variable that outlines that.
There's a spelling mistake for parents, M-I-K.
Yes. Yeah, it should be MKINC. Yeah. Yes, thank you. Yeah. Yes. I don't know why my spell checker didn't pick that up. Yeah. So now, suppose you're not in a couple family, but you're in a lone parent family. Okay, so if you're the parent in that family, this variable is identical to your own. So the MKINCP and MKINCI are the same thing. Okay, but if you're the kid, then you have your lone parent's income as the value in that variable. Okay, so you really got to be careful with what you're doing. Okay, so if you're not in a census family at all, so you're a non-family person, then again, this just repeated as your income is the value for that variable. Okay, so I sort of couch this in terms of market income, but there's a huge number of variables that are available for both you and as the spousal aggregate. So this applies to a whole bunch of different things. You know, your regular income, the tax credits, charitable tax credits, and so on. But then there's some subset of them actually that the _P suffix only identifies just the spouse. So for instance, your age, it doesn't make any sense to sum up yours and your spouse's ages, right? So the age _P will be just the spouse's age. Okay, and same thing with obviously year of death, year of birth. Those things don't lend themselves to adding them up. So just be careful when you're using that if you're playing around with the data. And to make things even more complicated, if someone has died, then actually, for instance, take this scenario, you you're married in 2016, your spouse dies, and you remarry in the same year, then market income underscore P will be the sum of all three people. Right? And in that case, I'm not actually sure that you can separate the current spouse's income from the deceased spouse's income. So just be careful working with these. Okay, so and just like any other data analysis in the RDC, there's vetting requirements. Okay, so standard, so you have to round counts and things like that. You have to round income numbers in the standard way. One thing that I haven't come across before that might be something in other data sets, I don't know, is this disturbance weight, which I'll talk about more later. And this just effectively adds unbiased noise to all of your statistics, okay, which is normally fine, except in one special case that I'll talk about sort of towards the end. And then there's statistical dominance. I'm not sure exactly how much I'm allowed to say. I know there's certain restrictions on that, so I won't talk in detail about it. But it has to do with not being able to, so the rules on the dominance test are, I think, partly confidential. So I won't talk in detail about that.
So I don't even know what the rules are for this data set because I haven't done the vetting.
Okay. So I think it's just to avoid you identifying outlying, I guess, large numbers. Okay. Okay, so those are the key things with vetting.
I think you can talk about it except for saying what the actual cutoffs are.
Okay.
There's secret numbers,
Okay. Okay.
but the concepts are not secret.
Okay. So in that case, if I'm not, unless I'm mistaken, if you take the ratio of the highest value to the bottom, the sum of the bottom n minus 3 values, it can't be more than X%, okay, of the value. Right? So you can't have one large number that is so large that it dominates the data set. Okay. So just, sorry, in case anyone was, so back in the LAD pilot days, with the vetting, we actually had to have conference calls with the RDC analyst and also people at the head office in StatCan, but since it's now publicly, or not publicly, since it's now rolled out outside of the pilot, you don't have to do the phone calls with StatCan anymore. Okay, first thing I'll say is that this slide and the next one were lifted completely from a LAD presentation that's online on the RDCN website by Paul Roberts, so full credit to him for putting these together. Just in case you were wondering how many people are in there, so this is just a total count. I guess this is an unweighted count, which is surprising that it's allowed to be out, but of the number of filers in the data. And so, you know, back in the early 80s, we're talking about 3 million people, and this has since risen to like 5.5. Okay, so there's a ton of records in there. And as I said at the beginning, the parent data set here contains both filers and non-filers that were identified in different ways. Back in the early days, those were a much larger proportion than they are now of the total. So this is almost nobody now. Now, in case you're wondering, so again, this is from Paul Roberts. In case you're wondering about how can I use this data set longitudinally, so how many, you know, what fraction of people are actually followed for a long period of time? So this just outlines to you over sort of a series of cohorts what fraction of people are followed for 10-year intervals. Okay, so back in the 80s, if you were to take someone in 1982 and follow them for 10 years, that'd be about 70% of the population you could follow in every year. A further roughly 20% or 15, I guess, would be you're seen at both ends, but you may not necessarily be seen in the middle. And then the blue are just, you know, you filed with some other pattern. Okay. So consistently across the board, right? So across all cohorts from way in the past up until now, you're looking at about 70-75% of people can be followed over a 10-year, continuously over a 10-year interval, which is pretty good actually. And then the rest, I mean, they might file irregularly, but it's not like necessarily that you're only following them for 1 or 2 years. Okay. So that's pretty good. If you're looking for doing longitudinal analysis, 10-year time horizon is actually pretty good.
families, right? Can you do that with the SIN number? If like a spouse is divorced and then remarries in another family, can you?
Yep. Yeah. So you could know. So if a filer has been selected for the data and their spousal information's attached, they have their personal identifier also attached. So if they remarry, then yeah, you'll know if they're there.
Earlier you were saying you couldn't identify the total income because it included the deceased one and the newcomer, but if you can follow the one that just came in from the previous family where...
Right. Yeah. So there's ways. Yeah. But I think I also want to emphasize that if you're sampled and your spousal information is attached to your record, I'm almost 100% sure that it doesn't necessarily mean that you're also in the data separately, right? So once you divorce, then you're gone completely from the data, unless you remarry or get sampled later.
So, for instance, then you've got a kid in there who is sampled in themselves, like they're a 25-year-old person that gets sampled in. Their parents' information would be in there if possibly back 10 years ago when they were living with the family, but only if their parent was also sampled in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Their current year information will be in there just through the aggregates, but
But will it? Because if you're a 25-year-old not living at home anymore, your parents' information.
oh, okay. So no, sorry, you have to be in the family for that to happen.
So
Yeah.
it's moved out, but you could find the parents going back in time.
No, I don't think so, because then there'd be no information attached to that record. And so they have a family identifier, which I think captured some of this, but just from the family level aggregates, I'm not totally sure that you can do that.
So I think someone at that came up with something along those lines before.
Yeah, it might have been from the T1 file, or maybe no, maybe not.
You said lab, but...
Okay, there is a family identifier, which I think probably captures that.
Yeah, but it's not a longitudinal, anyway,
Yeah.
complicated question.
Okay, I'll think about it, but yeah, I don't. Outside of the family identifier, I don't think you could, in the lab that's in the RDC, I don't think you can find the family member. Okay. So that's the basics of LAD, in case you were wondering. So, like I said at the beginning, the main reason I wanted to use LAD and had been wanting to use LAD before it was a pilot was for charitable giving research. So there's a very small group of us in Canada here that do this, much bigger group in the US. And sort of kind of unfortunately, there's very little actual data out there on charitable giving. So at the individual level prior to LAD, the only real data set that was available was the National Survey of Giving and Volunteering, later rolled into the General Social Survey. There were some aggregate data sets, so there was aggregate tabulations probably from the T1 family file available in CanSim. And then there's this T3010, which is the charity itself, their tax records. Okay, but that's not the same thing as individual giving. So at the moment, there's only exactly 2 Canadian sources for individual level giving, if that's what you want to study. So that's the data set I said before, the Survey of Giving, Volunteering, and then now LAD. Okay? And since the LAD has basically just been rolled out over the past few years, and to my knowledge, our little team here is the only set of people looking at charitable giving in LAD. There's not basically been nothing done on charities. Okay? And that's in comparison to the US, by the way, where using tax filer data to study charities has a pretty long history. Right? So they've been using long tax filer panels for quite a while to study this kind of stuff. So it's good that we've caught up. So the reasons we were so excited about LAD were sort of the many advantages that it has over the other survey. So the first and foremost, probably the reason why anyone uses LAD for anything besides the longitudinal part of it is it has a gigantic sample, right? So we're talking about several million people in each year. Okay? So that's nice for a bunch of reasons. It's always nice to have large samples for things like minimizing your standard errors. But also, if you're interested in things like studying the incomes of the top, some small sliver at the top of the income distribution, the only way you can really do that is with a huge sample. Okay, and so we actually wanted this specifically for that as well. So we study charitable giving among the top 1% and 0.1%, and I think we could have gone to the top 0.01% as well. 0.1%, sorry. So that's great. The other nice thing about this is that as long as you actually file for the tax credit, we think anyways that the information on your giving is pretty accurate. Okay, to the extent that people don't lie on their tax form or make egregious errors, you're accurately reporting how much you gave on your actual tax record. There's some questions as to whether the information in the survey of giving and volunteering is 100% exactly what's going on, right? So because it's a survey, you're asking people what they're giving and they're kind of recalling what's happening. So there could be, recall bias, or, just from the fact that someone's asking you about giving, you want to come off as more generous, you might inflate your actual giving, right? So one of the things I've always thought is a little bit dubious about the survey of giving and volunteering is that in any particular year, like 85% of people say they donated to charity, right? Which is much larger than in the LAD, which is more like 40%. Okay. So the real value is probably somewhere in between there, but at least we know that if you're filing for a tax credit, it's probably accurate what you're giving. And then from an econometrician standpoint, the fact that the data set is longitudinal allows for better identification of these causal effects, right? So the workhorse these days in terms of identification is the fixed effects model. When you don't have things like fancy instruments, instrumental variables, toss some fixed effects in there and things get a lot better, right? And this is one of the bonuses of this particular data set, right? So we have large numbers of people. We can actually follow them over large numbers of years as well. So you can have lots of sort of within individual variation going on there. Yeah.
This may not have much impact, but I know that you can save up your charitable receipts and just file every 2 years.
Yeah.
I imagine you take that into account.
Yeah, so we did this kind of like mini simulation, basically looking at how much would you actually gain from doing something like that. And especially if you're a large donor, there's basically zero savings, right? Because, yeah. So like the proportional gain you get from just piling them up is effectively like zero. Where it matters most is if someone's giving small amounts. Yeah, yeah. But even then, right? So it's the dollar amounts that you actually save there aren't huge.
No, but I mean in terms of looking at the giving, it looks spotty over the years.
Yeah.
But it's actually a receipt from the previous year.
Right. So yeah. So right. So what I'm saying is that, and from other results as well, it looks like people mostly kind of like, for the large part, give yearly or pretty regularly. There's not a lot of people that sort of give in 5-year chunks, basically.
Give it in 5-year chunks, but you save your receipts up for 5 years.
Sorry. Yes. There's not a lot of people that report their giving in 5-year chunks. Yeah. Yeah. But that's something we're kind of working on currently as well. And so the other nice thing is that it opens up these new research questions. So there's a lot of summary data out there on giving annually. So it gets a lot of press, how much people give every year across provinces. But the one thing that's not been possible in Canada is sort of tracking people across time within a particular individual and how they give. So what we were just talking about, without longitudinal data, you couldn't observe someone's giving patterns over a series of years. Right? So that's not something that's known. And something else we want to work on is these sort of age giving profiles. So tracking someone's giving across their life cycle, you might get different results from tracking different cohorts from 1 year to the next. So that's something we're going to be working on. Other advantages, so it's linked to your spouse. The nature of giving is such that you can transfer your charitable giving, your donations between spouses. There's no, you don't have to have your name on the receipt to actually claim it as a charitable credit. You can just pass it over to your spouse. And so by its nature, you have to study giving as sort of a sum of inside of a household sort of thing. The Survey of Giving Volunteering does not allow you to do that as far as I know. So long time frame. So what I was talking about before, if you want to sort of map out the profile of someone's giving across as they age, then you need a long time frame for that. So we got like 34 years to work with in the data. Very few people are actually observed from 1982 right to the end, but in theory you could actually look at them. I talked about this before. You can examine very high income groups, which you can't do in the other data set, and then this immigrant linkage as well is pretty nice. Okay. There's also really big advantages for this data relative to similar data sets in the US. Okay, so virtually all charitable giving research using tax filer data comes out of the US. Okay, but as we've tried to argue in our paper that's still looking for a journal, this data set is much better for that for a couple of reasons. In case you don't know a lot about the US income tax system, and I don't either, I know this little bit. So the charitable giving is a deduction from your income rather than a tax credit. That's the first thing. And second is that everybody gets sort of a standard deduction, right? So you get to deduct X percent from your income, not pay tax on it. Okay? And so what that means is that if someone is donating to charity and their charitable donations aren't as large as a standard donation, then you're not going to claim them. Okay? It's only when you donate so much money that it's in excess of this standard deduction that you actually see someone's giving. And in practice, so these are called itemizers. In practice, that's rich people. So in the US, the tax filer analysis is based almost exclusively on wealthy people. You miss that bottom end of the distribution entirely. Whereas in Canada, the tax credit applies equally to everyone as long as you have taxable income. Okay? So we still miss some people at the bottom, but not nearly as many. Okay? So better coverage of the low. The bottom of the income distribution is the key benefit of the Canadian data set. And then just, in terms of, so this has nothing to do with the data set itself, but the tax treatment of giving in Canada is much, much simpler, right? So you don't have to, it's just you get a standard federal rate and provincial rate for each gift, and that's it. They're complicating things now a little bit, but that's the way it goes. In the US, it's a deduction, and there's this itemization stuff, and it's just a mess. Okay? So it's much simpler to work with econometrically. Okay, but it's not the perfect data set. Okay? So if we're comparing to the Survey of Giving Volunteering, so there's zero information in the LAD on where you give, right? So we just know the total, and that's it, which is not necessarily great when it comes to things like studying patterns of giving, right? If you just know total giving. But all that information, in a lot of detail actually, is in the Survey of Giving Volunteering. There's no information on why somebody gives in the first place, okay? Whereas in the survey, people are asked specifically why they've chosen to give. So we missed some donations, so if people don't claim it for credit, so for instance, if you have very low income and you're not paying income taxes, you're not going to claim for credit your giving, so we don't know anything about that. Relative to the survey, there's almost no demographic characteristics, okay? And then, if you're someone like me who likes to work sort of a little bit in your own office, there's no public use file for the LAD or no synthetic data or anything, so you have to be in the RDC all the time. And then one more thing I'll add to that is that there's no information on volunteering in this data set either. Okay. So depending on what you want to do, the LAD's either a great data set for you or it's terrible. Okay? But for most applications, I think it's pretty good. Okay. So again, I'm gearing this around charitable giving because that's why I use the LAD in the first place, and it's the thing I know the best. Here's the key variables that you might use if you were to engage in charitable giving research. And I know some of you already have your research agendas already, and you're not charitable giving economists. But for those of you who I don't know and are looking for, say, thesis topics or something, there's a lot to be done here. So we know, for instance, your calculated charitable donations, which is the sum of donations to registered charities, but also to the government, okay? One of these days I want to go into the RDC and actually calculate how many people are making donations, aside from their taxes, to the government. My guess is virtually none. So there's different types of gifts. This OSGIF variable is your cultural and ecological gifts. So if you donate say a wetland or something to the government, that's an ecological gift. By the way, I should note that in charitable donations calculated, gifts of assets and things like that are just counted as regular charitable donations. Okay. The third variable with the long name, GVTB DONS, is separately donations made to the government. And then total donations, which is the one we work with the most, is the sum of all those things. Okay? And then separately, they tell you the tax credit that the person received federally only, not the provincial one. Okay. For reasons I don't know, the provincial one is not in there. Okay. So these are the key variables you might work with if you're doing charity work. Okay, so here's the projects that we have worked on and are currently working on. So the one that we did as part of the LAD pilot, so myself, Ross Hickey, Brad Miniker, Joanne Roberts, and Abigail Payne all got together and tried to work on this paper. So the effect of the cost of giving on your actual giving is, has a really long history. People have been studying this back in, I want to say, the early 80s, maybe even sooner than that. Okay, so long history in the US, lots of results on it. But as I was talking about before, in the US, it's really complicated to actually estimate this thing because of identification issues. So for instance, because charitable giving is a deduction from your income, that means that it's a sort of a complicated function of your income. Okay, so if you're estimating a regression of, say, giving on the cost of giving, then you have to properly specify the relationship between the cost of giving and your income, or else you're going to mess things up entirely. So here's, for instance, one problem. Let's just say that you're right on the margins of a particular tax bracket, and you give such a large gift that you push yourself into a lower tax bracket through the deduction. That means that the cost of your gift actually changes, and you're left with a complicated identification problem there. Okay. So it's been something that's been a huge problem in the US literature for a long time with no solution except, sometimes dubious instruments. Whereas in Canada, actually, it's much simpler, right? So because the charitable tax credit is only a function of your gift and not of your income by design, then it gets rid of that problem entirely. Okay, so it's a way simpler issue in Canada. So that's where we wanted to come in. Okay, so the paper looks at whether the tax credit for donations actually encourages your giving. So here's how this works. If you were to give a gift of $1 in the absence of any tax credit, you would forego $1 of consumption, right? So you give up your consumption to give the dollar. With a tax credit, let's say of 50%, you give $1 and the government gives you 50 cents back, you only actually gave up 50 cents of consumption. So the price of your gift, in this case, is your $1 gift minus the credit you received, and that's what we call the tax price. Okay? So federally, the credit rate on the first $200 of giving is, I think, 15%, and that jumps up to 29% if you give more than $200. And then provincially, there's an additional amount tacked onto that, which varies by province and over time. Okay. So like all other goods, charitable giving is, we think, a normal good, which should have a downward sloping demand curve, so that as the price rises, you give less. Okay. So that's the gist of this paper. As I explained before, because you can transfer the tax credit, the charitable giving that's claimed for a tax credit between spouses, we just sum up the giving within each couple in the household and look at that as the unit of analysis, and then take a subsample of the lads. So we only looked at 2001 to 2015, even though the data is available all the way back to 1982, for two reasons. One is computational reasons, because there's way too much data, and something I'll talk about later. And two is that the income tax system provincially changed at that time. So prior to 01, they had this tax on tax system where you'd fill out your federal tax form, figure out how much you're paying in tax, and the provinces would then peel off a percentage of that federal taxes payable. And that's how much provincial tax you owed. And so they switched it in 01 in most provinces. I think the only stragglers were the territories, to tax on income, where both the province and the federal government just tax your income at some rate. Okay, so that, for various reasons, made it much easier to do the analysis. Just to focus on sort of prime age individuals, we picked 25 to 64-year-olds. We didn't want to deal with anything to do with death, so we excluded anyone who was deceased themselves or filing on behalf of a dead person. For econometric reasons, we also excluded people who moved from one province to another at some point in the data set, so just people who stuck in their home province. And then duplicate spouses. So the lad takes a 20% random sample of SIN numbers, basically. So there's some chance, actually, that both you and your spouse are separately in the data set. And so if you were to sum up in each row the total gift between you and your spouse, then that would be in there twice. Okay, so we use the information of the linked spouse to get rid of any independent spouses that were also in the data. Okay. Yeah.
So are you identifying gifts or donations to other family members? And I'm thinking people who know they're going to die might do a gift to someone as a way of avoiding the inheritance tax or this kind of things. Have you looked at any patterns like this?
No.
Of donations that happen right before someone dies?
Yeah, so that's the reason why we got rid of the deceased people. So just in case there was any sort of, in the year that someone dies or something, there's a big gift or something like that.
But
That's,
does that happen?
it probably does happen. We wanted to just completely ignore that for this, but so that's something we talked about a little bit, just looking at.
Yeah, I wonder, so that's part of my question, so if you can't talk about kind of giving.
Yeah, so so that wouldn't be counted they wouldn't be able to claim like a gift to another family member as a charitable gift, but it's also the case that someone might, just before their death, just, dump a huge amount of their money into a charitable gift as well.
Or I suppose even if your spouse passes, it's common to donate some sort of causes related to that?
Yeah. So like the giving related to a deceased person is probably not the same as like regular gifts that you might make throughout your life, for various reasons, like that one.
So that excludes also death of the spouse? This exclusion?
Oh, yeah, so yeah, anything where the person or they were linked to a deceased spouse, yeah. So the other thing is that for two reasons, mainly for computational reasons, we just took a 50% subsample of the lad itself, because just for sitting around watching data for several days in a row gets kind of tiresome. So with a data set that large, you can just take a subsample and you get basically the same results. The sampling variation is not going to be large there. And the other reason actually is for avoiding residual disclosure. If you just take a random 50% sample and say you produce a table of means, you might not be able to take that table out again with slight deviations because of residual disclosure. But if you take a different 50% subsample, then I don't think there's any issue taking it out again. I think. we'll have to let the higher ups at StatCan decide that one, but that was the impression that I got.
Is that something we talked about in those calls?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. And I have more to say on this, this sort of large data size thing later. Okay, so the findings here are basically that the responsiveness of giving to prices, the elasticity is about -1. So for every 50% reduction in the price, you donate 50% more. So for instance, if you gave $100 to charity in the absence of any credit, and then the government comes along and gives you a 50% credit to that gift, which lowers the price by 50%, then you would take that $50 that you got as the credit and actually give the whole thing. Right? So that's what the -1 means, is that you pass the entire credit on to charity as an additional gift. Okay? So if you were more responsive than that, then the tax price would actually make you give more than the tax credit back to charity. And anything less than that is you actually keep some of it for yourself. Okay? So I think anything at -1 or below, or larger in magnitude than -1, is good. Anything sort of in the more inelastic region is not that good. Okay? So in Canada, things are looking good in terms of the way people respond. Most of the effect that we see is on the intensive margin. So it's not that the tax credit is encouraging new people to give, which happens very rarely. It's more that people who are already giving are just giving more, which makes a lot of sense. And the other thing is that if you drill down a little bit, most of the results are driven by young, low-income people. So the biggest response to the credit is by the very youngest fifth of the data set. Okay? And then also, surprisingly, the lower-income individuals. So this is kind of our take on this, is that one of the problems that we might run into when, as the population ages, is that because the youngest people are the most responsive, as the population ages, this sort of tool to get people to donate is going to become less and less effective.
When you say young, you say what age?
In the bottom, yeah, so we just did quintiles, so the bottom fifth. So I don't know exactly what the ages were there, but the bottom fifth, the youngest of people. And and when I say age, I mean age of the filer themselves, not their spouse. All right, so that's a quick overview of that project, which is now done, except, again, sitting at a journal, hopefully published soon, but that's probably not going to happen. So because it's such a great data set, we also have proposed a series of other projects, which are part of an approved program of research that we have now at the RDC here. So there's going to be at least 4 projects involved with that. So the first is a descriptive piece. So like I said before, there's no end to the number of descriptive charitable giving pieces out there, even in Canada. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel on that. What's nice about this data set is we can focus on a different aspect of it, which is just the longitudinal aspects of giving. So things like I talked about before, age profiles of giving, which we don't have the information on up till now. What I'm calling giving survival functions, which is we take a bunch of people in a particular year, and then every year subsequent to that, calculate what's the likelihood that you give conditional on you haven't given yet. I guess that's more of a hazard function. Okay? We can flip it and do a survival, whatever, it doesn't matter. So this gets at the whole, what's the pattern of giving? Do people give every year mainly, or is it you give sort of in a choppier pattern than that? And then the other thing we want to talk about is sort of what happens to your giving in terms of life events. So suppose you're a single person, and then at some point you get married, what then happens to your gifts to charity? Okay? Or suppose you're already married and then all of a sudden you get divorced, what happens then to your gifts? Okay? Or having children, or you could imagine other life events as well. So that's part of something we want to work on. We haven't started that yet, really. Just a couple of little things. The second piece is we want to do a comparison of immigrant versus Canadian-born giving. So taking advantage of that IMDb stuff. So basically, if you're familiar with this labor economics literature, which looks at immigrant versus Canadian giving over time, these age-wage profiles, basically the exact same thing, but with giving. Okay? So suppose you're an immigrant that lands here, what's your pattern of giving compared to someone who is born and raised here? Okay. You could imagine, for instance, that there's a transition process, so your giving might not be large when you first get here, but then would pick up slowly after that. Okay? One thing we'd like to look at is the types of gifts that you make. I know that a lot of people who immigrate here end up actually remitting a lot of income back home. So they might not necessarily do charitable giving here in Canada. So that might be the reason for low gifts here, but until we look at that, we don't know. The third project is sort of an extension of something Abigail, Payne, and I already did. And this is this relationship between giving and the ethnic or religious diversity of your neighborhood. Okay, so let's say that I live in a neighborhood that's very ethnically mixed versus one that's completely homogeneous. Would my gift be different in that case? And what we found using aggregated charity data in the past was that yes, it is. So the more heterogeneous your neighborhood, the less your gift. Okay, but one of the things with that is that you can't sort of drill down into sort of subsamples of people to look at exactly who's driving this. Okay, so is it men, women, older people, younger people? We could also, in the data set, track, maybe the reason why gifts change in a neighborhood that becomes more diverse is that the big givers just leave, right? It's not that they're giving less, they just pick up and move to a neighborhood where other people are already giving more. Right? So that we can study with the data set. That's what we plan on doing. Fourth project is related to something I talked about before. This is marriage and giving. So there's a couple of papers that got a lot of action in the giving literature about what happens to your gifts when you get married. Okay, so you might think that, let's say I donate $100 and before we got married, my spouse donated $100. We get together and combined we donate $200. But that's not necessarily the case. So you can write down a theory which says that depending on what happens, if me and my spouse have really different views on where our gift is going to go, this disagreement imposes costs on us, and our total gift is actually less than the sum of our individual single person gifts. Okay? And I actually can't remember the exact results of this. But anyways, there was a difference, so it wasn't just the sum of the two individual gifts. So we kind of want to study a version of that with the LAD. Okay? So we're going to look at, over time, two people who were previously single and eventually get married, and then what happens to their gift. Okay? Other things we want to do with that are, looking at whether there's a difference between opposite-sex couples or same-sex couples, right? So is there any difference there in terms of what happens to your gifts when you get married? Something that can't be done, I don't think anyways, in the US studies. And the last bit is whether there's a relationship between charitable giving and political donations. So there's tax credits for both. The tax credit for a political gift is much more generous, actually, than the one for a charitable donation, although there's caps on the political gifts that you can make. And so suppose it's an election year, and you're thinking, I really like Trudeau, I want to support him, so you give a bunch of money to the Liberal Party of Canada. Does that then come out of your charitable giving, right? So do you substitute out into the other? Or you can think about it in another way, right? So if I'm the kind of person that likes to give money out, maybe I they're complements. Maybe I just when I give more to one, I give more to the other. Okay? So that's going to be something that we want to look at. So that's sort of on the table. And then that's the projects that we're looking at. So a bunch of different things that should probably keep me and my co-authors busy for several years. But now, I guess maybe probably the reason why people showed up here in the first place was what are the problems, general issues with using LAD? So anybody who's been around my office around the time I was working on that charitable tax price paper knows that my biggest complaint is the size of the data, right? So that strength is also its weakness. The LAD is humongous, both in terms of the number of observations, so millions of them yearly, but also just in terms of the storage size, right? So if we're thinking about Stata format by itself, each yearly file is like 10 gigabytes in size. So it's just a huge amount of data, right? And so if you're a Stata user like myself, there's just a bunch of things you can't do, right? For instance, you can't just link all of the individual yearly files to the register and open that, right? You'd get 3 years deep, and then that would be it, right, out of the 35. Most of the RDC computers have 32 gigs of RAM or less. There's one really nice one here in the RDC that has 64 gigs that everybody wants to use. But even there, right, you still run into an issue opening the whole data set. So it's impossible, literally impossible in Stata to open the whole data set. But let's just say that you open a subset of the data. Our working data set for this project was like 7 or 8 gigabytes in size. Even then, right, even the simplest commands take forever, right? You run a summarize command and you're sitting there waiting for 5 minutes, right? You forget about a logit, like that's not happening at all. XTReg, the fixed effects estimation, also not happening at all. Okay, we're talking about days in terms of how long these things run instead of minutes or hours. Okay, so I actually, the biggest surprise to me was like how much effort I spent trying to get around this problem. Which included, by the way, thinking about possibly like buying a computer with a huge amount of RAM and then asking if it could be put into the RDCs to work on, which, with lots of money that could happen, but not on the docket at this time. Okay. So here's some of the solutions I came up with for this, right? So the one thing that we talked about before is you just take a subsample of the data, right? So in our working data sets, we mainly actually worked with even less than 50%, like 10% subsamples, just to make sure that things ran through. And then once you know that your estimation's working out okay, then you up it to the 50 and let it run for a week or whatever. But then it's still difficult, right? So you can't what you can't do is open the register, merge all the data in, and then take the subsample. What you have to do is take a subsample from the register, merge in 1 year of data, get rid of the rest, and then repeat the process over. So our file, which may or may not be inefficient, to just get our working data set takes like 2 days to run. Okay? So it takes a lot of time. But once you get past that hurdle, it works out okay. And then in terms of Stata, there's a series, so with big data being a thing now, so there's users of Stata that have written commands that work specifically for giant data sets. Okay, and one of the most problematic commands in Stata is xtreg. Okay, so this is I'm sure we all know this, but I'll say it anyways. The Stata command that does fixed effects estimation or random effects. For whatever reason, with a large number of fixed effects, that command fails completely with a huge data set. I think it's because it stores the fixed effects that it actually estimates them later and stores them. So let's say you've got 5 million fixed effects, there you've just added 5 million variables to your data set, right? So it just crashes and burns. One extremely nice command which I've misspelled, it's reg, oh no, sorry, it's fine. Reg HDFE, which does exact same thing. It sort of has as its base, I believe, the areg command in Stata. And it just runs through things much faster, right? And in our case, it made fixed effects estimation actually possible versus impossible with the other command. So use that if you can. And then the absence of that, just learn SAS, I guess. Okay, but even then, back in the early stages of our project, we were sort of compiling our working data set in SAS and then exporting it to Stata. But even the SAS program took several days to merge all those data sets together. So there's some solutions for you. The other issue that was a little more subtle that we came across was the disturbance weight. So again, so just for the purposes of not being able to figure out individuals in the records, StatCan makes you add this disturbance weight, which is unbiased weight, basically that hovers very close to 1, which adds just a little bit of noise to your estimates. And that's fine in things if you're doing things like a mean or a standard deviation or whatever. But when you're doing a regression, there are certain cases where that's a big problem. Okay, and effectively this is just adding measurement error to your data. And as we all remember from our econometrics class, the problem there is attenuation bias, so your results are going to be biased towards 0. And this is mostly a problem when the signal variance is large relative to the total variance of the signal and your x variable. Okay? So effectively, it's the biggest problem when your x does not have a lot of variation. Okay? And in fixed effects models in particular, that's a huge problem when x doesn't have a lot of variation and it's also highly autocorrelated over time.
Did you run the same models without that weight just to see if it was
Yeah, yeah. So big change in
That seems to be something they might, did you report this out?
yeah, I did. Yeah, yeah. So
You're not as worried about the regression results.
yeah, yeah. So yeah. So in just a couple of cases in this tax price paper, there was major differences with and without that weight. We're talking like 20–30% of the size of the coefficient.
So it actually changed the results.
Yeah, yeah.
But again, like I said, there are often the requirements for summary statistics are quite different from the model output.
That's
Yeah.
standard for-
Yeah, but
My-
This is something.
My understanding is they want you to use it if you can, right? So if it doesn't affect the results, then
okay.
use it.
Oh,
Yeah.
did they give you the choice of not using it?
Yeah. So
You had to beg, I-
well, no, it wasn't the choice. I just reported that on the disclosure, and yeah,
and I said, okay.
and it was okay. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So yeah, so you just got to be careful with the disturbance weight. Obviously, there's also the sampling weight, which is just 5, right? So it just inflates the number, which has no effect on the regression results, but just ups the counts if you're doing counts. Okay, so that's just those are the general problems I ran into. Nothing too major. So this next one is sort of general, but also specific issue for me, but also might be general. So this is a graph of by province and summed up for Canada as a whole, the fraction of people who donate to charity from 1983 right out to 2015. Is there a? Okay. So the thing that kind of stands out, first of all, is that there's this declining pattern, which is not encouraging. Right? But then there's this weird, in the early 80s, weird pattern here where it jumps up from like 20% in most places right up to 50%. Okay? And look, if you look right here, this kind of dashed dot line is Quebec. So in 1983, we start off at 10% of people giving, then down to basically 0, and then the following year up to 35%. Okay? And if you drill down in the data, it looks like this is like 0.5% or something that are giving. So, and then, this is similarly odd. So my view on this is that there's something really weird going on with the charitable giving information in the early 80s. And I have no idea what's going on. I haven't actually asked StatCan, but maybe that'll be my next my next step. My view is that this data here from 83 to 86 for giving is unreliable, and I would not use that. And so the reason this is more general, by the way, is that there might be issues with other things as well besides just the charitable giving. Okay.
What's that one line that's real low? I can't see the.
This one here, this is Nunavut. So they start off in 1999 and then, yeah. So this is, percent of donors. And then the most generous here, as I learned when I lived in Manitoba, is Manitoba. They like to talk about that a lot out there. Okay. Related to this, here's the mean donation in 2015 dollars within each province over time. And again, so what's going on here is in Quebec, we have this, for whatever reason, the average gift is just over $5,000. And what's actually happening, if you look at the data, is that almost nobody gives except for except for a small number of large gifts, right? So clearly something wrong. So again, don't use the before 1986 data until we figure out what's going on there. But just since I got a few minutes here, got pretty encouraging results here, actually, just looking at the summary stats. In Canada as a whole, which is the solid red line, which you may not be able to see that well, real gifts have been increasing pretty substantially. Okay. Incomes as well, but gifts are keeping pace. And then the biggest giver, we got to fix the colors on this because I can't actually figure out who this is. It's either, it looks like it's Alberta, yeah, and that makes sense.
Do you know what year it started where anybody was able to give through the store? When the store started asking you as you're about to pay, would you be willing to give $2?
Yeah, I don't know, actually. Don't know, but I guess my guess would be like within the past 6 or 7 years, maybe? I might be wrong. Yeah, so that's the thing, because the stores don't give you a tax receipt for that.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't be able to claim that unless I'm sure you could ask them for one.
No,
But-
but people might have changed their behavior as a result.
Oh, you see, you're thinking that this would be lower than it otherwise. Okay. Yeah, that's possible. Yeah. You don't really see that showing up here. Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing that I was just thinking about is, I don't know how new it is, but Facebook now on your birthday apparently gives you the option of having your friends donate to a charity on your behalf.
Yeah.
I only know this because my nephews have been doing it, right, and they're young, low
Yeah.
income. And I imagine that that's having an impact across the country.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess this is sort of another one of those things you can't really pick up with this particular data set, but that would be like super interesting.
In general, like young people think more about volunteering and giving, as time goes on, there's more emphasis on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It might, be able to show the societal trend in relation to the.
Yeah. Yeah, so
demographics.
I was gonna say, maybe once we drill down in terms of like age categories, we'll see kind of a spike amongst young people that you don't see amongst older people or something like that. Yeah, it's interesting. I know, there's other research that have used sort of things like Facebook, right? So the research is more along the lines of, does the nudge that you get from being, asked on Facebook actually make you give versus not being asked at all? And I think the results are positive, but I'm not sure. Okay. So I think this is, the second last thing. Here's the Schedule 9. This is what you'd fill out if you were doing your taxes and you gave a charitable gift. So up here on line 1, this is the donations that you actually made to charities. Line 2 is donations to the government, then charities outside Canada, that you're allowed to donate to, things like the UN, things like that. UN is its own. And so this gives you the total amount of eligible donations, right? So this is what we would actually want if we were studying charitable giving, line 6. But what we actually get is line 340, okay? This is the lower of this or this. So it caps it at the limit of your actual giving. So what you see in the data set is allowable charitable gifts, not eligible charitable gifts. So if anyone donates so much that they hit the cap, all we know is that capped amount, okay? And that's no good. And so effectively, this kind of creates an issue, especially for these larger givers who, I'm thinking about someone who doesn't earn a ton of income, but is wealthy and gives a large gift, right? That would be capped in our case. Okay, so, I mean, again, the data set's great and everything. There are some issues. This is one of them. We don't exactly, when we looked at it as part of this tax price paper, I don't think we noticed too many people right at the cutoff, the 75% of your income, but it could still be an issue. Okay? There's no shortage of very large donors. Let's just put it that way. Okay, and then the last thing, which we already talked about, you can claim the donation. Either spouse can claim a donation. So you have to study giving in terms of a household decision, not an individual decision. Because the LAD takes a 20% sample randomly, there's a 4% chance that you and your spouse both appear in the data set separately. So if you take the filer's information and sum the spousal information, and then the spouse appears later, and you also sum up the information, you're effectively going to have duplicates. Okay, so if you're studying household type stuff, you got to make sure you get rid of that. Okay, so so I got 10 minutes left, I guess. That's my last slide. So just to summarize, LAD, as you know, is a big administrative data set, longitudinal in nature. It's, for us, people that study charitable giving, it's probably like the most exciting thing to happen in a long time. There's lots of different projects that haven't been done before that could be done now, and there's no limit. We talked about all the advantages it has over the other data, the Survey of Giving Volunteering, and other US data that we're trying to take advantage of. A few disadvantages like the one we just talked about, but there's workarounds. And so our plan anyways is to spend at least the next several years kind of turning around projects on giving. And then I guess that's it for me, unless there's any questions.
I think not, but I was wondering since you have all of this data more extensively than I have. So it's only information from the T1. So if you find out any other complementary thingy, like schedule something or other, or an additional tax form, that is not in there.
Yeah, so it's only T1, although I mean, stuff from the other, like this information from the Schedule 9 appears, right? So line 340, 342, and then these three as well. Or sorry, this one here. Where is it? Donations made to the government appears.
Schedules are there.
Yeah, maybe not all of them, but this one for sure, and some others as well. Yeah.
So from the demographic characteristics, is there any variable that relates labor force, or that you can infer from the T1 to the T5, like whether you work in the public sector or private sector?
I don't think you could tell whether someone's working in a public or private sector. I mean, you could tell whether someone's working by the employment insurance information. There is occupation, I think. So that might. There's no. I thought I saw occupation in there. Industry? I think one of the two is in there.
What is industry might be?
Industry but not occupation.
Yeah.
Okay, so industry then. Yeah.
So that line.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that LAD is connected to IMDb. Are you aware of any other data set that's been linked to LAD so far?
I'm not, but Christine looks like she is.
Yeah, the ELNLP, the education data sets, should be being linked to it. Technically, I think it's supposed to be available now. So that I'm not 100% sure on that, but that's the idea anyway. So that's the post-secondary student information system, the registered apprentice information system. Yeah, those are the two key ones, I guess. That's basically being linked into the T1 class.
So directly to the T1.
Yeah.
So if they linked it to this, you'd be missing some on both sides.
Yeah, no, sure. But there was talk, like at least the web device suggests it's also connected to the lab.
Just to add, I remember there was some discussion maybe last year or the year before about linking the 2016 census to LAD. I don't know if that's already been done, but it's also unclear whether it would be the whole LAD, I guess, yeah, or whether the LAD would be merged into the census and you just have the 1 year, or if the census would be merged into the LAD and then you could follow people backwards as well. Don't know. Yeah, well, so like you're talking about the tax price paper. So that one probably excluded most students because we had 25 and over. But in theory, that would be like if we had the younger people in there. Yeah, that could be, yeah. Yeah, maybe some grad students in there, yeah. Yeah, but that would be a good explanation for that, yeah.
I have a quick question just related to the lab initially. You know how some people, so the Revenue Canada checks some of these files and others no, so there's kind of a random, like sometimes they go over all your receipts and then you get a letter and others no. So there's kind of a, is there a way that the data tells you that the person has been like audited or not? Or improved accuracy of?
I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think so. And yeah, I don't know what happens, just thinking that along the same lines. I mean, if someone gets audited and then they then change their information, does that get updated in the future? I don't know. My guess is no, but who knows? Well, so they get the data, I think, 2 years after filing year. So some of the people who I guess are audited and fix their return are probably updated in that time period, but after that, I think probably no revisions. All right. Well, all right. Well, thank you. Yeah.